In 1983 and 84, I was able to discuss the issues in a calmer atmosphere. There was more humor. There was more self-deprecation. There was more relaxation, frankly. And I think what came across was a clearer picture in the public mind of what George McGovern is all about, the kind of man I am and the kind of convictions I stand for. And I can only tell you the response from both the public and the press has been more gratifying than I ever could have expected. In 1972, the country was torn in two by the Vietnam War. This country was literally split right down the middle. You did have a generation gap. You did have an ideological gap known as the Hawks versus the Doves. It was a rather bitter time in the political life of the country. We also went through the searing impact of the Watergate episode and all the disillusionment and bitterness over that. And having come through that era, I think I was somewhat scarred by it in the minds of a lot of people. Not that I did anything I have to apologize for, but I was part of the controversy.
My recollection of that speech, and I proved to be wrong, I said to myself, how can anyone not vote for this man, son of a Methodist minister, a PhD in history, from the Great Plains states, clearly almost sort of embodying the American dream, talking about first principles, the basic issues facing the country. Why was my perception wrong? And what do you think? What was the problem there?
Well, I think there were a number of problems. Number one, I was on the receiving end of the most heavily financed negative campaign that any candidate has ever experienced. Just non-stop television commercials painting me as an unstable radical, painting me as anti-defense, if not anti-American, a person who was willing to give the United States Treasury away to the poor, all kinds of distortions about my philosophy and the positions I'd taken on the issues. I think that was a major factor in the outcome of that election. Secondly, I don't have to tell you, we had a lot of difficulty over the vice presidential selection, and I think that confused the thinking of a lot of people about that campaign. But basically, I'm convinced, looking back on it, that no Democrat could have been elected against Richard Nixon during the Vietnam War period. He finessed that issue so that he seemed to be standing firm while at the same time claiming to end the war. And he never really got hooked on the horns of the Vietnam dilemma. He finessed the whole issue.
Do you think something similar is happening with the Democratic Party in general? I mean, in other words, to draw an analogy perhaps to 1972, President Reagan seems to escape criticism. He's made a number of flagrant errors on the part of his critics in the Middle East, in Central America, and some other issues, and yet it doesn't seem to quite take hold. And are we going to find ourselves in a position where people have a second term, sort of like the Nixon second term, and say, why wasn't I listening more carefully to these debates and these issues?
Well, that capacity of Mr. Reagan's to evade public blame for his public mistakes has been responsible for a new phrase in American politics, the Teflon factor. And it does seem that somehow Mr. Reagan can be involved in the most calamitous mistakes, like the loss of those 265 Marines in Lebanon, and somehow come off that without any personal blame. I think it's his skill on television that explains that. He's the first Hollywood actor ever to occupy the White House, and he uses the power of television as effectively as anyone I've ever seen, with the possible exception of the late John Kennedy. That, in my judgment, is the explanation for it. He's also a conservative, so he has a lot of conservative publications that have a special interest in not stirring up things against him. Most newspaper owners and publishers are of a conservative bent, and I think that helps him. But my guess is once the Democrats nominate a candidate and we're down to one Democrat versus one Republican president, you're going to see that gap narrow. I'm very confident this election in 1984 will be extremely close. It won't be a Reagan runaway.
What would you say is the single weakest area in the Reagan administration?
I think his failure to work out any kind of a relationship to the Soviet Union. The first responsibility of every American president since World War II has been to arrive at an acceptable accommodation of some kind with the other superpower, for the very good reason that if that breaks down, then there's no hope for the race, because these two countries, if they ever come to blows, will not only destroy each other, but most of the rest of the planet with them. Every American president except World War II, except this one, has seen fit to talk to the leader of the Soviet Union. It's a matter that just appalls me that this first 4 years of the Reagan administration is apparently going to come and go without a single minute's conversation between the President of the United States and the President of the Soviet Union. I think that's an enormous and dangerous failure on the part of the Reagan administration. When you answer a question about what's the most important failure, sometimes I say the failure to do anything about the arms race, but that's an outgrowth of the failure to do anything about Soviet-American relations in general.
And now that he's been to the People's Republic of China, it would seem that it wouldn't be such a hard pill to swallow to do something similar with the Soviets. Do you think that's something as a lack of advisors who have serious knowledge of the Soviet Union, or something deeply rooted in the president?
I think it's deeply rooted in the president and his advisors. They feel that the Soviet Union is such an evil force, and they're so conditioned over the years to a kind of a knee-jerk anti-Soviet reaction to everything, that they read the worst possible interpretations into everything that happens in Soviet-American relations. Now, obviously, none of us that believes in freedom likes the Soviet totalitarian system, but I take the same view as the late President Eisenhower did. Whether we like them or not, we have to coexist with them, because the alternative to that is no existence at all. It doesn't make any difference whether you like the Soviet system or whether you don't. If you're a realist, you will understand that we have to live on this same planet with them.
That leads pretty directly into the arms race, which flows from the relationship with the Soviet Union. You had, I believe, the most sweeping proposals in the current primary season in regards to defense, and I wondered if you might outline what you think the Democratic Party, as it enters the general election, ought to be espousing in terms of defense policies and the arms race.
Well, first of all, we ought to be strongly advocating a nuclear freeze as a beginning point. That's the first step, just to halt any further production of nuclear weapons. I would recommend that no matter what the Soviets do, for the simple reason that even if we didn't build another nuclear weapon, and they continued to build 1,000 every year, it wouldn't make any difference in terms of the nuclear standoff. We would still have the capacity to destroy every living Russian with just 10% of the nuclear force we already have. They could do the same thing to us with 10% of their force. So what real difference does it make from a security standpoint who's ahead under those circumstances? Consequently, I think the Democrats ought to press for an immediate halt to any further production of nuclear weapons for an indefinite period of time, during which period we'd try to negotiate a genuine nuclear arms control agreement. Perhaps first a mutual freeze and then substantial cutbacks in spending for nuclear purposes. I don't see any reason why we couldn't advocate safely a cutback of 20 to 25% in our overall military spending. That would mean eliminating things like the MX missile, the B-1 bomber, the nuclear aircraft carriers that are now under production. It would mean eliminating some of the battleship fleets that have been taken out of mothballs. It would mean cutting back on some of our troop deployments in Western Europe and South Korea, doing some of the other common sense things that would still leave us the strongest country in the world militarily, but not the country that's wasting the most money on excessive military outlays.
There seems to be some growing opinion to cut military waste on Capitol Hill. I had a conversation not too long ago with Senator Andrews from North Dakota, a Republican, who was concerned about the MX and waste and the battleships that you mentioned in this Do you think there is serious hope of really challenging the military budget in the near future?
I do indeed. I think for the first time since I've been in public life, and that's nearly 30 years, you have the beginning of a consensus in the Congress that too much is going into the Pentagon. Every congressman that I know of wants this country to be adequate in its defense, but there's more and more evidence of waste, these enormous cost overruns and non-competitive negotiation of contracts. The payment, for example, of $400 for a single hammer of the kind you could buy in a hardware store for $6 or $7, that kind of thing is beginning to prompt in the Congress a real re-examination of military spending. I'm convinced that the right kind of a president could persuade Congress to whack that military budget pretty much in the range I've suggested, 20 to 25%. If I were President of the United States, I would bring in as Secretary of Defense somebody like Lee Iacocca, and then I would say to him, you do for the Pentagon what you did for Chrysler Motor. Get rid of the fat, get rid of the unnecessary executives and bureaucrats, give us a decent product and do it for less money. That's what he did at Chrysler. I think a person with a hard-headed business approach could do that at the Pentagon. The second thing I would do is bring in somebody like Seymour Melman to set up an economic conversion planning capability so that you could divert resources, scientific, technical, and labor resources that we're now plowing into the creation of military weapons, into the productions of things that the country really needs: a modern rail system, modern mass transit systems, alternative energy strategies, environmental structures to protect the environment. These are all things that have to do with national security and national defense that would give us a real payoff in contrast to the money now being wasted on military overkill.
You've been interested in economic conversion to military industries for quite a while.
As a matter of fact, the first year I was in the Senate in 1963, working with Professor Melman, we devised the first economic conversion act. It had 31 Senate co-sponsors. That was the high point of the sponsorship. I think I introduced that bill every year for the next 18 years. The problem with it is that we put it in the fall of 1963, and that was about the time things looked good for Soviet-American relations and for a cutback in military spending. We also looked like we were headed for a surplus in the Treasury. But then the war began to escalate, and it gobbled up additional resources, and the whole climate changed towards economic conversion planning. I think if we continue on our present course, we'll be involved in another Vietnam-type war in Central America, perhaps before the November elections, if not before, shortly after, if Mr. Reagan is reelected. He has said that he will not permit a communist revolution to triumph in Central America. Now, the fact is, in his view, that is now happening in El Salvador. The insurgents, whom he identifies as communists, although I doubt if the average El Salvador insurgent knows the difference between a communist and a jackrabbit, nonetheless, he identifies that whole revolution as a communist movement. And if it begins to succeed, as I think it now is, he's committed to doing whatever is necessary to defeat it. I don't think it can be defeated except by the introductions of large numbers of American forces. In Nicaragua, he's committed to harassing and sabotaging, and I think to overthrowing the Sandinista government. That's not working out very well, notwithstanding the fact we've hired 10,000 mercenaries in Honduras, largely old Somoza National Guardsmen who have gone there from Nicaragua. He's hired these people to go in and try to destroy that government in Nicaragua, and it apparently is not working. That being the case, I think it's highly likely that in the next few months you'll see American forces fighting in Nicaragua as well as in El Salvador. Now, my own view is that the president is wrong in assuming that these troubles in Nicaragua and El Salvador are all caused by the Russians or the Cubans. I think if every Russian and every Cuban disappeared today, there would still be trouble in Nicaragua and in El Salvador, because people in those countries have had enough of this exploitation, misrule, greed, the cruelty with which they've been treated. These Somozas, for example, in Nicaragua, who for 50 years misgoverned the people terribly, stole everything in sight. They were crooks, and they should have been driven from power, and they were. But I don't think the Reagan people see it that way. They're willing to embrace these right-wing military dictators as long as they wave an anti-communist banner. And when they're under attack, as they now are in El Salvador, they're inclined to go to their aid. By they, I mean the Reagan strategists. And I think that means war sooner or later between the United States and these little countries in Central America. It is not overstated. We are sponsoring terrorism and sabotage in Nicaragua. When we helped them mine the harbors of Nicaragua, we engaged in a flagrant violation of international law and international decency. What are we to say if mines that our secret agencies were responsible for planning and for planting in the harbors there of Nicaragua had blown up ships from Japan or France or England or the Soviet Union or anywhere else? There were ships damaged as a consequence of those mines, and these Contras that are maneuvering in Nicaragua to try to sabotage the government there are armed and equipped and funded by the United States. I think that's a shame for a great country like the United States to be engaged in shabby activities of that kind. Here is Nicaragua, an impoverished little country. They're trying to build it up, and we have paid mercenaries blowing up the bridges, blowing up the waterworks, destroying their oil reserves, doing everything they can to make it difficult for the government. I don't agree with that.
What is the failure, in your opinion, in the Reagan administration to understand these things? In other words, you said a minute ago, and you have before, that if the Soviets and the Cubans weren't involved, the conditions are such that revolutions would be going on. And you immediately started talking about the history of these areas and back. Now, as someone trained as an historian, I mean, is the Reagan administration lack historical perspective, or is it ideological blinders or pressures from interest groups? What is a sort of basic failure to understand a culture that is right below Texas? I mean, it's not far away.
I really am baffled as to why people have difficulty understanding these revolutions, particularly since our own country was born in revolution. Most Americans are proud of the fact that their ancestors told the British to get out, that we were going to run our own affairs, notwithstanding the fact they had sworn allegiance to the British crown and we were subjects to the British king. Our forefathers decided that they weren't going to take what they saw as unfair taxation, unfair trade restrictions, the quartering of troops in some of their towns and homes, and so they revolted. And they did it violently with gunfire against the mother government. And yet we seem to have difficulty understanding why people want to do that in Nicaragua and El Salvador, where you have these lousy, rotten governments that have exploited them for years, much worse than the British government was towards their subjects here in colonial America 200 years ago. I would think anybody who has read the history of the American Revolution or the French Revolution would have no trouble at all understanding the revolution now going on in El Salvador and the one that drove Somoza from power in 1979 in Nicaragua. I personally think it's because they feel they have to do that to survive politically. I think their reading of it is that while they know we have a vast overkill capability, that For 40 years now, we've been told that we have to do everything we can to strengthen our military defenses, and so rather than refute that doctrine, they simply reduce the annual increase below the Reagan level. Reagan's calling for a 10% increase in military spending every year automatically. That means in 10 years you'd have a 100% increase in the military budget no matter what was going on in the world. And Vice President Mondale and Senator Hart take the view that maybe 4% is about right every year. I think, frankly, that's a concession to American politics. They're afraid of being labeled as anti-defense if they were to call for a cutback in military spending or even a freeze on military spending.
Assuming that Vice President Mondale becomes the nominee, will you be able to exert any influence or pressures on areas, say, Central America, where you have spoken out quite strongly about our involvement there, and the former Vice President has not as of this point?
Well, when I came into the race in September, the Democratic nominating race, no other candidate was even discussing the Central American issue. There was just silence on that issue. I began calling for an immediate termination of all U.S. military operations in Central America, and I was getting an electric reaction from audiences, very favorable. So I noticed the other candidates began, after watching that for a while, to discuss that issue. But in Mr. Mondale's case, I don't think he has a strong enough stand on that issue, and I am going to try to persuade him, if he's the nominee, that this is an area where he ought to really lock horns with Reagan. I think the Reagan people are headed for war in Central America. I have no hesitance, although I'm sad to do this, to predict that we will be involved in a war in Central America before the end of this year. And I think the Democratic nominee, whether it's Hart or whether it's Mondale or Jackson or whoever it is, ought to really go after the Reagan administration on this issue right now.